Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to wait a couple of minutes. One of our presenters is fighting traffic to get to her computer. We're going to give her a couple more minutes, and then I'll get started. And we've got still some people that haven't signed on yet. So thanks for your patience. We'll be back in about 90 seconds. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ron Lamberty, Senior Vice President with the American Coalition for Ethanol. Thank you for taking part in our webinar today. We're going to get started here in just a bit. Kristy Moore is still trying to get to her computer. She just happens to be joining us live from Mexico today. So one of our topics being Mexico, that'll be, I think, a good opportunity for us to learn a little bit about what's going on down there. We put this webinar together to talk about several of the things that we're looking at and facing in market development. And one of the things that we always do, those of us in the marketing world, we always like to think that things can just happen because the math is right, because the product is available, because people want it. And we often overlook things like the rules and regulations that have to be put into place in order to make those products move. That's the heavy lifting oftentimes. The fun part is seeing when people get new shiny equipment and labels and are ready to sell it to consumers. But prior to that all happening, there have to be a lot of rules and regulations and barriers knocked down so that people can sell our fuel. And one of the people who's been doing it longer and better than anybody else is Kristy Moore. Again, she'll join us when she can. I'm going to go ahead and get started on some of her stuff. She says, I just got a text from her saying she's calling in now. Kristy is the principal scientist with KMoore Consulting. And you all know her if you've been to any kind of ethanol activity in the past, gosh, I don't know, 20, 25 years. So I'm going to go ahead and start on this, and I'm sure she'll correct me when she gets on. But Underwriters Laboratory is the group in Illinois that tests most equipment. Oh, it sounds like I have somebody joining in. Kristy, are you there?
I am, Ron. How are you today?
I'm good. I was just starting the Underwriters Laboratory page. So if you
Fantastic. Bienvenidos.
Yeah, bienvenidos, yes. Now, are you in Mexico City? Or
I am today.
Okay, all right. Well, we've got that at the end of the presentation. To start out with, we want to talk about the fun, the hard work, the heavy lifting that goes into making it possible for those of us who only think about things like labels and stickers and names and tanks and that sort of thing. That makes it possible by making sure that the rules are all written in such a way that people can do the things that we want them to do. So I'm going to just turn that over to you, and we're on the Underwriters Laboratory slide, and just I'll just click them when you get done with each page.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Mexico City. It's a rainy 73 degrees here today, which I think you guys are under some sweltering heat. We have jackets on down here today. The ozone is at a moderate level. We can see about, the visibility is about a mile, and typically it's about 5 miles. So we've got some air quality issues that we're trying to address down here. And speaking of addressing issues, you know, we talk about some of these elements down the weeds, but really what we're trying to do is just facilitate the regulations so that ethanol is treated no differently than any other fuel or gasoline component. You know, we do have a flammable material that is coming into contact with the general public. So for those of us who have worked through operations, owned retail stations like Ron, you know, we are keenly aware of the fire hazards that we deal with on a person, you know, on a really hand basis. But when it comes to the general public, I mean, we've even seen pictures of people smoking while they're fueling their cars. So, you know, these are the reasons why we have people like Underwriters Laboratory. So because of the fire code requirements and trying to protect the general public, we have these safety listings requirements. So what happens is before the equipment is suitable, you know, meet the regulatory requirements, they have to be tested to the Underwriters Laboratory, or a competitor to Underwriters Laboratory is ETL, or there's a couple of other fire safety listing companies, but we will have the product and all the equipment from the tank through the nozzle tip tested. And this was a huge issue for us, if you remember back in 2006, where we had built a significant E85 retail presence, but yet, you know, we found that there wasn't appropriate testing protocols for E85. Well, here we are 12 years later, and not only have we addressed the listing requirements for E85, we have also added several other additional ethanol listing opportunities for petroleum equipment manufacturers. So the way that Underwriters Laboratory is important to us is that, you know, like in my state of Illinois, we have a fire marshal, and the fire marshal enforces the fire code, and usually they adopt model regulations like National Fire Protection Association 30 or 30A, or the International Code Council, ICC, those safety requirements. They will recognize that the equipment must be certified to a listing. So this, so now we have 4 different criteria for our listing for ethanol concentrations: 87A, 87A, E25. Understanding that somewhere around the 25 to 40% ethanol mark, the hydrocarbon alcohol blend, and maybe this is when Ron starts to fall asleep because I talk chemistry terms, but the blend itself starts to take on more polar alcohol characteristics, and we've done a lot of study in this area, and we really have found that the blend acts the same, whether it's got 1, 5, 10, 25, or 40% ethanol, as it does just, you know, just the introduction of ethanol or having no ethanol. And then, of course, we've got the highest safety listing of, you know, E for E85 being 0 to 83%. And the reason why there's that usual disconnect between, you know, calling it E85 and having 83% is that 2% denaturant that we're required to have. So this is important for us, especially as we're looking to the future in high octane fuels, knowing that we want in those high octane fuels a minimum of 25% ethanol, but we have seen some of the auto industry benefits and some of their research showing an ethanol benefit as high as 40% in the charged cooling and being able to capture some additional octane benefits. So, Ron, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about ASTM. Nearly every state of the United States requires gasoline, ethanol blends to meet an ASTM standard. And the ethanol industry is posting very good attendance and participation in ASTM. But just to give you an idea, Subcommittee A, DO2, Petroleum Products, boasts about 2,500 members. And that's people from the petroleum sector, from the terminals, from the pipelines, from the ethanol sector, from the auto industry, from state regulatory, federal EPA is there, regional EPA members are there. But out of the 2,500 members, the ethanol industry has about 56 members. So if you do the math, yeah, we're not posting great numbers as an overall attendance, but really we are seeing the highest ethanol participation at ASTM than we ever have. And that's really dating back to the 1980s. Our ethanol industry is also spanned over and started joining Committee E48, Bioenergy and Industrial Chemicals from Biomass. And it's just important for everyone on the phone to know that these two committees are developing standards, test methods, practices, which would be considered protocols, that are directly facilitating ethanol industry business strategies and goals. Now, probably about 5 years ago, maybe closer to 7 years ago, when I would put a slide up that showed the ASTM specifications for ethanol, there would have been 2. And now you can see from the slide here, we're boasting 7 fuel specifications that include ethanol blends. And you can see in the right hand, you can see what the ethanol content is here. You know, the gasoline specification boasts 0 to what we call a predominantly gasoline blend, which would be 0 to 51% gasoline. And now we're saying, from an ethanol standpoint, 0 to 49% could actually be covered by this spec. We have the blending practice. So we made this specification because in states like Illinois, and there's a handful of others, every fuel must meet an ASTM standard. And when we wanted to offer blender pumps, E20s, E30s, E40s, we did not have an ASTM standard for that blend. And D7794 fulfills that role. D8011 is our specification for natural gasoline to ensure that the product that we get at the facilities, at our ethanol plants, both that could be used for denaturing or the hydrocarbon portion of an ethanol flex fuel E85 blend, that they could meet D8011. A part of our participation in the Ag Auto Ethanol group, where we are collaborating to find, a higher octane / ethanol combination that facilitates improved fuel economy, improved advanced combustion, lowers emissions, and helps the auto industry meet all of their CAFE standards, GHG reductions, CO2 reductions. That is D8076. D8181 is a brand new specification for a microemulsion blend stock. We pulled all of the resources together, and no kidding, this is where we could actually put ethanol as a microemulsion in diesel fuels, and we're really looking for this specification to be used in the state of California to enable the LCFS program. And then, of course, we've got the legacy ethanol specifications, D5798 and D4806. For the folks on the phone, it is important that we made a significant change to D4806. We have had the legacy test method for acidity, D1613, just removed from the specification. Now, I know that doesn't mean much for everybody on the phone, but this is a huge deal for us. So the legacy test method 1613 did not require a nitrogen purge. We have suffered with this test method. We had ethanol traversing the globe. The ethanol would get to the port. They would test it. Maybe they put stat gas in the vessel compartment as they pulled into the port, and the ethanol would raise a false high acidity result using the test method D1613. As that ship sat in the port, we paid demurrage. We paid third-party inspectors and third-party laboratories to test, retest, There was then, negotiation with our customers for the product being out of spec when it was really a false positive high result. So we, as an ethanol industry, approached ASTM. We wanted this test method removed. We have an exceptional test method in D7795 that includes all of the test method protocol from 1613 in the new test method. So we're not losing any capability, but there is an emphasis on the purge step. And so what does that practically mean? That means that you need to address your C of A's. You need to tell your third-party labs they can no longer use D1613. And as you can see in the D4806 Table 1 performance requirements, that test method no longer appears as an appropriate method. So this is just kind of a reminder for folks as our ethanol is going further and farther that, we have a new test method that we need to make sure that we're listing on our C of A's. What are we doing currently at ASTM? Well, we're now balloting the removal of D1613 from the ethanol flex fuel specification. We expect a smooth go of this because we've already passed it for D4806. It was a strategy of ours to take one specification at a time so that if we had any technical opposition that we could address them and not have to do it twice. We're also balloting the addition of up to 85% ethanol in the vapor pressure method D5191 and the short-term method D6378. This is important because we want all of the test methods used for gasoline to also be applicable to a broad range of ethanol gasoline blends. We expect this to pass. We've got a very comprehensive interlaboratory study that we've done proving that these test methods are appropriate with up to 85% ethanol. Down the third bullet, I hate to throw acronyms out at you, but this we're going to use on here, discussing how drag reducing agents and detergent solubilities are issues for ethanol fuel blends. We have had issues kind of sporadically appear where drag reducing agents have been over additized, their concentration is unacceptable, and at these high levels of DRA addition, they are insoluble somewhere around the 40 to 50% ethanol concentration range and higher. So this becomes an issue when your denaturant, natural gasoline, regular unleaded, etc., are used for ethanol flex fuels, E85 blends. We end up with some clogged filters. We've seen this in the state of Iowa, and we're trying to determine how best to address these issues when additives are completely soluble in gasoline, but insoluble in higher ethanol blends. And it's kind of like the tail wagging the dog when we try to address having an appropriate additive concentration, because really these additives are just for hydrocarbons. They're not, for gasolines, and they're not designed or engineered to be for E85. But the E85 volumes are so small that we really don't have good leverage to talk to our additive companies. But we are taking up the stance and not giving up. We have proposed a specification for ETBE. We are doing this. I am actually the task force chair, especially on the cusp of the good news that the Japanese is going to allow corn ethanol to be used as a blend stock for ETBE for applications in Japan. We feel that this was also an opportunity to get ethanol into the market, not only in Japan, but in France and in other parts of Europe where ETBE is very common oxygenate use. That is now out for ballot. And we also are watching a proposed specification for gasoline compression ignition engine fuels, which do not necessarily embrace higher ethanol blends. So we're watching some of these other gasoline specifications as they're being developed through the ASTM process. What probably is of great interest to folks, and I see that Opus is covering this today, that we have some current activity in Committee E48. Our membership does continue to grow. We did have to, utilize some emergency rules within ASTM. We didn't have a robust roster, and we had to allow everyone a vote in order to get to a 60% voting presence. And now that we've got a significant, not as significant as CO2, but we've got more than 100 members, we did have to balance the vote. We did lose 22 votes in the process. But I have great hopes, and I am the chair of this committee. I am doing some heavy recruiting of both the ethanol industry, the biomass, the industrial chemicals, and the bioenergy industries to bring additional members, to bring back the votes. So I don't lose sleep over it, but just so everyone knows, we did have to go through some roster manipulation to get into balance per ASTM protocol. We could no longer operate on some emergency rules. But we have some great biomass standards and some other tools. We passed D3050 as denatured ethanol for use as a cooking and appliance fuel. We do have some countries around the globe that suffer with lack of access to clean fuels to use for cooking applications. They burn dung, they burn charcoal inside their homes, which gives off toxic emissions from burning it, but yet they need that type of fuel in order to cook food to feed their families. And so we've got 3050 to help clean cooking fuels get more embraced and go through a customs application a little easier. We have D3060 as a relative practice for assessing sustainability. We in the science community are very critical of sustainability and assessments. Like today, they want to assess ethanol, whether it's sustainable or not, as its own entity and not compared to what ethanol can replace, such as fossil fuels, which have zero sustainability attributes. And so we have we've published a practice for assessing relative sustainability. So we think this is a more scientific way of assessing, especially renewable fuels. We've also got a couple of new work items, and this determination of the converted fraction, which is the next slide. We've also got a fermentation method that we're developing. There's a lot of new products that are fermentation aids that are being pitched to the ethanol plant as assessing greater yields, which are a huge asset and a huge part of growing our industry. But we don't have a common fermentation method by which we can assess the fermentation, the new fermentation products versus what we're doing today. So if you had a method to show that, then you could more thoroughly assess your products. But of great importance, and what OPUS is covering today, is the ASTM initiative to draft a standard for quantifying the ethanol that's produced from cellulose and from starch in an in situ, which is a commingled fermentation of starch and fiber. And so last June of 2017, the POET, the Soliton, Cargill, ADM, ICM, a lot of ethanol producers came to ASTM and wanted to talk about how to develop a standard that could be used by EPA and other authorities to determine an accurate measurement of the ethanol when it's co-produced from starch and fiber. Let's go to the next slide, Ron. So you'll see that we have started down the path of developing a standard practice. This is the official title for the determination of the converted fraction of starch and cellulose content from a renewable fuel production facility. You can see with the 1 through 11, the sections of the standard practice. The task group has discussed the comments that came from the last 2 failed ballots. We have a ballot open currently. It was issued on August 19th, and it closes tomorrow. As of the other day, we had no negatives. We do anticipate a couple of negatives, primarily from US EPA. They've got some concerns with calibration standards, standard reference materials, and a couple of other elements that we think we can address maybe over the next 4 to 6 months. So we're keeping an open mind if we do receive a negative on this ballot. I also think that there's strength in publishing this standard, knowing that, we are free to ballot at any point in time with technical justification within ASTM. And so when the calibration standards and standard reference materials are available, we can modify any ASTM test method or standard or specification. Let's go to the next slide, Ron. Here's another organization that I am intimately involved with, and that's the National Conference on Weights and Measures. Why are these people important to us? They're a formal organization of all of our state regulatory officials. These weights and measures officials in each state regulate not only the grocery scales when you buy produce and then pay for them, they regulate farmers markets, they regulate corn, they regulate the meters that we certify when we're at loadout and we're loading ethanol trucks, and then we apply those volumes on a net and gross basis onto our bills of lading. They are the ones that regulate all of these inspection and testing of not only our bulk wholesale transfers of product, but also retail fuel dispensers, labeling, and price disclosures. This group, NCWM, publishes a model regulation called NIST Handbook 130. This model regulation is adopted in whole or part by at least 12 to 15 states, and really it's more like 25 to 30 states that base their state regulations on wording that appears in NIST Handbook 130. Why it's important to us is, unfortunately, we're playing a lot of defense in this arena, in this model regulation. The American Petroleum Institute has a constant quest to restrict E15 labeling and ethanol flex fuel labeling. We have just compromised on a significant effort that took me 2 years to have appropriate, neutral, non-restrictive labeling on ethanol flex fuel. We just adopted the Federal Trade Commission, who is the government agency that describes ethanol in all dispenser labeling. What we've currently got is another rogue effort by the Petroleum Marketers Association to prohibit the labeling of E15 with an octane rating. This is extremely problematic, especially as we're, going to overcome the 2,000 to maybe even 2,500 stations offering E15, and the labeling that we've settled on is unleaded 88. The Petroleum Marketers Association proposal would prohibit that type of labeling on the dispenser. So as we're seeing increasing market share and seeing additional labeling and totally legal labeling, we see PMA throwing some rogue and some oppositional efforts to restrict our labeling. FTC allows the octane, posting of octane, and no kidding, we as an industry totally funded the accurate and precise measurement of octane, both research and motor octane, up to 25% ethanol. So there's no technical, scientific, regulatory basis. This is just another effort by PMAA to curb our success with E15.
All right. Thanks, Kristy. For everybody on the phone, if you've got questions, we're going to answer those at the end. There's on the right side of the screen, there's a little bar that asks for questions. You can type your question in there, and then we can get to that. Kristy mentioned PMAA. So my next slide is far less technical. What's PMAA's deal? What's the problem with those guys? I had the opportunity to talk to Rob Underwood, who's I don't know if he's the president or he's the executive director of PMAA, last week at the Pacific Oil Conference. And believe it or not, they do understand E15. It's just a question of why would an organization that portends to represent petroleum marketers be causing so many problems with the fuel that so many of their customers can and should be selling. They've got 8,000 independent petroleum marketers that are members. NACS is a larger organization, National Association of Convenience Stores, but PMAA makes plenty of noise. As Kristy just mentioned, they're working all the different angles on labeling, whether it's they've been on record as saying that it shouldn't be sold as gasoline, and they've been on record as saying it should only be sold as gasoline, depending on what issue it is that they're after. In the conversations with Rob, what he mentioned to us, and what you see a lot in the news, are concerns, and I should have probably put quote marks around that because they're not real concerns, they're manufactured concerns about infrastructure. One of the things you've probably heard if you've gone to any kind of gathering where they talked about fuel marketers and problems they might have with E15 is that it is impossible to determine whether or not your tanks and pumps are compatible with E15. Excuse me. Not only is that not true, it's we've got some experience now, and we're going to be taking that experience and putting it onto our website here. But it's not only possible, it's done all the time, determining whether or not your tanks are compatible. We had a great example of a situation that happened while we were at the fuel ethanol workshop this summer. A station up in north central Nebraska had a fire marshal come in, say his tank wasn't suitable for E15. It just so happened that that was a station that I had helped build back when I was a fuel marketer. And before I even had the chance to, step in and try and help them find everything, the people who owned the station got a hold of the pump equipment installer. The installer found the record of the equipment, and they found out that it had an A designation on it. The tank had a number, but it ended with an A. The A wasn't on the registration, but it was on the invoice, so they were able to do it. So it is possible to determine whether your equipment is compatible. It's just a matter of finding one of the one or two or maybe three equipment suppliers in your area. If you're somebody who just bought a station and you weren't the person who put the equipment in, if you put the equipment in, you may have records of it. And I know we, after that happened, we had came back and Chuck Beck did scoured the records, and I believe he found that there was some kind of tank registration, some kind of tank record body in every state of the union. So not only is it possible, it's really not very difficult. What they do then is roll that comment into talking about new equipment. It kind of becomes moot when you realize, again, if we're talking about just E15, and most of the time, as far as underground equipment goes, the tanks, if they're compatible with ethanol, they're compatible with blends up to 100% of ethanol. So all of the things that they talk about, digging things up, replacing tanks, generally are not really an impediment to do an E15. One of the things that's been sort of an unintended consequence of us all promoting the big chains that have switched to E15 is that there are people who believe that only the big chains have enough money to do it because they believe items 1 and 2 here, and so they think it's number 3. And because we've talked quite a bit about some of the big companies who've received BIP funds and prime the pump grants, there are smaller marketers who believe that only the big guys are the ones that are getting assistance to do these things. And one of the things, just to put a flag up, because we have a situation where in the early 90s to mid 90s, most tanks in the US were replaced because of regulations that required them to be upgraded and have leak detection and have, in some cases, double wall tanks, and most of them now, I think, if not all of them, and Kristy could probably answer that, if they're all double wall tank requirements. But because those things were all put in the 90s and had 30-year warranties, there are going to be a lot of tanks that need to be replaced or upgraded, or some kind of discussion is going to have to be had about the tanks we have underground right now over the next 5 years. And some of them are happening right now because I think the regulation passed in '88. And so some people got on it quickly in the next couple of years. And so they're looking at having to replace their tanks. I think there'll be an effort. There already is some effort of trying to make that an E15 thing. It's not an E15 thing at all. And so I want to make sure people are aware of that. So if they start hearing about E15 causing an underground storage tank crisis, that it's actually just an underground storage tank coming of age issue, and it'll have to be dealt with, but it's not an E15 issue. They do get it, though. The Petroleum Marketers Association of America does get what's happening with E15. In a letter that they wrote to the Federal Trade Commission trying to get the labeling changed, they didn't want it called unleaded because they thought that caused people who had cars that could use unleaded to use it, which they're correct. That's exactly why we tell people you can call E15 anything you want as long as you call it unleaded. That's what seems to sell it to people. So this is a comment directly out of their letter with an E15. It's currently cheaper than E10 gasoline and as much as 10 cents per gallon. And retailers that use E15 as a marketing tool to draw customers in their station can steer them towards fuel that produces the greatest profit margin. Great. That's something we've been trying to tell marketers for, 10, 15, 20 years, I guess, about ethanol fuels. And now they basically acknowledge that. And I thought the best line was the one where he said competitors who do not sell E15 are at a significant competitive disadvantage to stations offering the higher ethanol blend. And that's really what it's about. Many of their marketers, members that are small marketers who have been convinced that they can't put this stuff in, believe that the other guys have an unfair advantage over them, and they, rather than adding the fuel themselves, they're trying to find ways to stop the other guys from selling it. Now we are addressing those infrastructure concerns, no matter how goofy, off base, wrong those concerns can be. We do need to address them because people believe them. We're pointing out by having people who have already done that, by having marketers talk about the things like I mentioned before with the situation in Nebraska, that it is very possible to determine your E15 compatibility. The Ag Auto Ethanol Alliance, Kristy mentioned earlier, there's a communications committee. They wanted to put together an infrastructure communication piece where we gathered together marketers from across the country, from different sizes of operations, from Mike Lorenz at Sheets to single station owner Glenn Badenhop from Ohio, to talk about the things that they've done and what they've found with E15. And again, these things are strictly E15 because we do believe that there's a likelihood that so many of these people, especially the ones who have 3 tanks and put one in to sell mid-grade, which none of them sell at all in any kind of significant volume, that they could literally just take their other fuel out and put the other one in. And I don't, now Kristy will stop me and say, well, now wait a minute, they need, yes, I know they have to do those steps like making sure they don't have water in their tanks, but we're not talking about having to buy any new equipment. They can use the existing equipment and switch to E15. And that could happen fairly quickly. Now, we created, a few years back, we created a marketer advisory panel, or MAP. That was when we came out with the roadmap. We thought that was clever. And so we talk to them at least quarterly, sometimes more often than that. It's 7 marketers from different size operations, different parts of the country, talking about their issues. They are hearing, as we have at Petroleum Marketer shows, that retailers are asking how they can do E15 rather than why would they. There's branded marketers that have been contacting us. Just as I mentioned before, I went to the Pacific Oil Conference, where it's primarily California oil marketers that are there, and they can't sell E15 because of the rules and regulations. But marketers from other states do come to that convention, and they were asking about selling E15 and what they had to do and how they could get their branded supplier to allow them to do that, because many of them have contract language in their contracts that say you can't sell E15, you can only sell products that we offer, and we, this oil company, does not offer E15. That's probably why, although E15 has been legal to use in all the reformulated gas areas, you still haven't seen a giant surge of use in those markets. And it's something that even once we get year-round E15 approval, it's something that we're going to have to battle with. We have noticed also that association attitudes are changing. Some of them openly disagree with the way PMAA is handling E15. They would like their marketers to have the opportunity to sell it because they've seen other marketers do well with it. We are working on possible workshops with some of those states for their members. And when we do that, we will be including other petroleum marketers, other ethanol, E15, and flex fuel marketers as the speakers in those particular um, um, events, because that's again who marketers trust. There's been a lot of discussion about marketing E15 to consumers. We have had a lot of marketers approach us telling us that they want us to help them market E15. And the thing that we heard so many times was, you guys got to tell us what the heck we're selling. What do we call this stuff? And rather than talking about a brand name, which is what they weren't necessarily after, what they were after was some agreement on what we would call this fuel when consumers buy it, so that if somebody buys some from Bob O'Connor in Wisconsin and then goes to Nebraska on vacation, that they stop at one of the stations there, they can look for the same fuel. And so a lot of them, led by probably Thornton's, who started out selling unleaded 15, and then Sheets when they switched from E15 to unleaded 88. There's been a push, and is quite an effort going forward now with calling this fuel unleaded 88. Now, beyond that, some of them will brand it beyond that. Some companies have their own fuel name, and they will call it whatever it is. But we needed a product name, and that's what unleaded 88 is. There are still people who are marketing it as regular 88. They're still marketing it as unleaded plus or regular plus or unleaded 15. But in most cases, what we found is that consumers want to see the word unleaded because that's what they use in their car. The E15, I think Bob O'Connor said, why don't we just call it XZ47, because it means as much to them as E15 does. And he's right. If you pull up to a pump and it says E15, for the most part, the only E15 or the only E product that anybody knew was E85, and that needs a flex fueled vehicle. So it's pretty simple to be able to use the same product and then let them market beyond that. One of the things that we've heard quite a bit from people when we talk to others in the people in the ethanol industry is they're concerned about us marketing ethanol to consumers. It's something, any kind of meeting we go to, there's that discussion of how do we market to consumers. The marketer advisory panel's advice was don't. That consumers are their customers. They want to market to customers. Now, don't get me wrong. They would take any funds we provide them. They would be willing to participate in promotions. But for the most part, they're not having trouble necessarily selling our fuel to consumers. They point out that they are our customers, and what they would like from us, the things that have been most important and have shown the most volume and most profits for them, are things like reliable, competitively priced supply. Over the years, we've had webinars and had discussions, I'm sure, with a lot of you talking about making sure that appropriately priced fuel that reflects RIN values, that is easy for people to get at their stations, is probably the most important thing. And any place where we have reliable, competitive priced ethanol, we have good volume of ethanol sales in higher blends. Interestingly enough, they want more E15 retailers. Sometimes you'd think that somebody wants to be the only person selling a product, but what we've heard almost without exception from people who are selling E15 is that they want more people selling E15. And I probably shouldn't be calling it E15 when I talk about it, because they would like it sold as unleaded 15, unleaded 88, unleaded, whatever we call it. Unleaded 88 is the preferred name. So they would like more people selling unleaded 88. Probably the best example of that, again, is Bob O'Connor. 2 stations that he put E15 in, marketed it as E15, did a lot of advertising. The corn growers helped him with advertising. Sold a little bit of it, but then when Quick Trip in their state, Bob was also president of the Wisconsin Petroleum Marketers, and he talked about it when he was at the state convention and when he talked about it at their meetings. Quick Trip decided they were going to go ahead and move, although they had been dragging their feet because they did not want to move until the summer RVP thing got taken care of, but they decided to go anyway, and they decided to market as unleaded 88. And when that happened, Bob also switched to unleaded 88, and his unleaded 88 business took off. I think he told us at our convention that in this 14 weeks following the change, he was up in volume by 276%. So almost tripled his volume. But the idea is there, when more people see that product, then it's not a weird product that they not need to think about, or that they need to look up, or that they need to read about. They see that name, they know they've used it before, they've seen it before, and they start using it more often. They also, to a person, tell us that they need E85 to remain viable. Give you an example of that, probably the best example of why that is, as Bob said, and Glenn Badenhop said, you know, I get more margin on the products like E85, and that allows me to maybe cut my margin and be able to fight on the street with the big guys with using E15. And E85, because of the reliable, competitively priced supply, sales have been increasing pretty dramatically in all these stations. So it seems like the timing of car companies that are reducing their availability of E85 vehicles or flex fuel vehicles because of the fact that they don't get as generous a credit, if any at all now. It seems the timing is bad, and so we need to make sure that if you've got an opportunity on whether it's commenting on rules or any other opportunity you have to encourage EPA to give car makers credit for selling flex fueled vehicles, and to encourage car sellers to market flex fueled vehicles, you need to do that. Just as an example of what kind of volume that is, you know, the state of California has gone in 5 years from selling about 6.5 million gallons of E85 a year to where last year they sold 24 million, and they might sell as much as 50 million this year. Now that 24 million represents 17 million extra gallons of ethanol above E10. In California, they're required to have 83% ethanol in the fuel year round. So you're talking about a home for 17.25 million new gallons of ethanol. If you're selling E85, or I'm sorry, if you're selling E15, you would need to sell 350 million gallons of E15 to sell the same amount of E85, to sell the same amount of ethanol as you find in that California E85. So 350 million gallons of E15 to sell the same amount of extra ethanol that they're selling in California in E85 right now. I think it works out to like 9 billion miles worth of E15. So the E85, every chance I get, I want to encourage people to keep pushing E85 and doing everything we can to keep that viable. Now, along all these lines, we've got the flexfuelforward.com site, which is basically a site that's marketers telling other marketers what they've done. It's going to be going over an overhaul so that it's a little more user-friendly, especially on mobile devices. We'll have a little bit different content, and we will be making a few more movies. So that's something that we're looking forward to. We advertise in industry publications and online ads, and we do search engine marketing. We're going to trade shows, and in most of those trade shows, we will have a fuel marketer, an E15 and flex fuel marketer with us. And whenever possible, we're putting the fuel marketers in the spotlight, because that's who marketers want to hear from. They want to know that it's somebody who's selling our product, and it works best for us because it's an automatic third-party endorsement when a station owner says that they want to use your fuel and that they've done well with it, and that they encourage other people to do so. One of the things that I want to point out is right now, with the prices the way they are with ethanol, we're in a situation that we've been in before. Annual ethanol consumption, here's what we've had every year. And just as a side note, anyone who, I know there's people who get kind of upset and start talking about, the RFS, and maybe it would be nice if we didn't have to do that. The last time we thought we didn't need a piece of legislation was in 2011, when we thought we could do without VTEC, and you see what's happened to volume since then. All of these things are things that keep the market fair. And one of the things that drives volume is lower prices. If you look at this, the chart that I've got here, ethanol consumption increases. So this is how much it went up during these particular years. As you can see, 2008 was one of the busiest years ever for new ethanol volume. The 2 years before that, 2 years after, were also busy. And what you can see on there is that that yellow bar is the price difference between ethanol and gasoline. There was a 16-month period from about May of 2007 till September of 2008, where ethanol averaged, and this is with the VTEC tax credit, averaged 79 cents per gallon less than gasoline. And so markets where they weren't selling E10, like in the Southeast and in the Northeast, ones that had just learned about the renewable fuel standard, and we're seeing ethanol more available in their areas, started using ethanol and did well with it and couldn't help themselves. They had to sell it, or else they'd be buried by their competitors. This is just more of a closer view of those particular years and how much volume was added during those years. So I think we have an opportunity here over the next 8.5 months to where, especially with something like E15, where we don't really need a lot of new equipment, where we can encourage some of these people to just do the math and take a look at how much lower their price can be on fuel and how much possibly more fuel and customers they can bring in, and encourage people to give it a try so that they can stay with their competitor or put a new bar out there for their competitor to meet. And with that, I'll go to Mexico. We just got just a few minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of make this quick. Just to let you know what we've been doing there, what I've been doing there is talking to Mexican fuel marketers, station owners, and equipment companies about some of the same things we've talked about for the last 18 or 19 or however many years I've been here. But a lot of it is math. It's just a matter of ethanol is so inexpensive right now compared to gasoline, compared to MTBE. And this is just a slide I took out of one of my presentations of what we show there. These are prices in pesos per liter. I don't, Kristy might be able to calculate them a lot faster than me, but whatever the difference is, ethanol is a bargain there, and it's become more of a bargain. I think probably 6 months ago, we wouldn't have bet that there would be a lot of ethanol sold in Mexico anytime soon, but it sounds like there will be, because I think that's why she's there. I talked to him about things like splash blending and how we got that, how we did that around most of the United States, and we're able to use the fuel that came out of the terminals and just add ethanol to it to make it, lower cost and higher octane. This is a slide directly stolen from Kristy's deck. So just to talk about some of the different things that are concerns in Mexico, and some of the things that we know that Mexican fuel marketers and equipment companies and people who want to do business in Mexico will be looking at. So it's a pretty grassroots, pretty marketer to marketer kind of discussion of, hey, here's how we started in the U.S. and as you could see, over the years, it's been some of the same discussions. The difference is we've done it many, many times. We've got people that are willing to go down there and help them, and we've been able to talk to these guys, talk about the things that they can expect, what they shouldn't expect, what they can worry about, what they shouldn't worry about, and let them know that there are people to help them with the process. So that's what we've been doing. I think I'm going down again in October, again to the same group, fuel station owners and equipment suppliers. The crowd increases at everyone. The questions become a little more realistic about what they can and can't do, and I think that market may be moving a little faster than we expected. So with that, I think I'll check and see if we've got any questions. Okay, I've got one that asks, can any station that is selling E10 switch that equipment to E15 from your statement that the equipment is certified for any ethanol can handle higher blends? My understanding from E10 to E15, and then Kristy, jump in if you need to here, but the UL standard that she put up first, the UL 87A that was for E10, the reason that E15 was chosen as a potential blend is because that standard had tests within it that tested with 15% ethanol. And UL did say that if your authorities having jurisdiction will allow it, then E15 can be used in E10. With EPA, I know their requirements are that you either have a third party like UL list it, or you have the manufacturer guarantee it, and the guarantee has to be in writing for the fuel that you're selling, which I believe all of the major, I know Wayne, Gilbarco, and Bennett all have that. They all guarantee things up to 15%. As far as the underground stuff goes, it's important to know what you've got. And that's why I'd say, regardless, you need to go probably to the pump and equipment company nearest that station, find out what they put in, when they put it in. And I think it's, tanks are certainly one of the things that you can almost always say will be compatible. Piping, there's some piping that's not compatible with E15, and it's not compatible with anything else either, because there was some really lousy piping put in the 90s, I think it was. And the adhesive things, I've been looking at some stuff there, but I think the adhesive question is fairly easily answered too. But Kristy, if you want to weigh in on that and tell me where I got it wrong.
No, actually, I agree with you. And my answer would have been more of a legal, it depends, right? And I hate doing that because I'm a scientist, not a lawyer. But, if you've got a tank, so we know the Xerxes tanks back in 1981. So a tank 37 years ago that was installed probably is not compatible with E10, let alone E15, and probably let alone with the gasoline you're putting in there today, right? So all carbon steel tanks are compatible up to 100%. All tanks manufactured by Xerxes containment solutions, et cetera, since, like you mentioned, since the early 90s, maybe even late 80s. Those are all compatible. And those, we talk about tanks because of the biggest expense, right? I mean, you're talking six figures. You're talking breaking concrete. You're talking loss of business, those kinds of things. And we focus on those. And then, like Ron said, we've done so much investigation into this now. My comment would be highly likely. Your insurance company is going to have a list of your equipment installer, which usually has to have a permit in your state, is going to have a list of your equipment. I think as PMAA or some of the naysayers say it's impossible to prove this, we've got 160,000 stations that are offering E10. You've got to have that proof at some point in time. Not all of it was grandfathered. And so I think the comment is it's highly likely. We did have some yellow underground piping that was installed, and it was under a massive recall for gasoline. It dissolved, it soldated when exposed to just regular hydrocarbons. And so, it's a difficult question to answer because we have a lot of petroleum equipment manufacturers, but there is a strong likelihood that it's compatible with E15 and maybe even, higher.
Yep. And I've always told people, if you're not sure, or we don't have any interest in putting ethanol, whether it's E10, E15, or E85, into any equipment that won't be compatible with it, because especially when you're talking about some of the piping that Kristy mentioned, and I mentioned that, we talked about that was just bad piping. I would rather never have ethanol in that piping because we're going to get the blame for it when something happens. So that sometimes surprises people, but if they're not sure, or if they don't know, if they can't find it, our answer would probably be, probably better not do that. That would be mine, at least. I'm sure Kristy would probably say it before I ever got it, before I exhausted some other attempts to do it. This is one, and I think it's probably the last one we're going to have because it's only a couple minutes. So this is probably an easy one, Kristy. When will new terminaling facilities in Mexico that will help ethanol distribution be completed?
Oh, Lord. There is a huge influx of industry dollars into develop, and extend Pemex's capability. So Pemex owns the 70 or more terminals that are down here in Mexico today, and it's severely undersized for this type of market. If you think about the entire country of Mexico consuming the amount of gallons that the state of Texas consumes, you know that we're dramatically undersized down here for the consumption. And the gasoline market in Mexico is growing at a rapid rate, between 5 and 8%, depending on the geographic area. And so it's important to know that there is a huge influx of dollars and investment in the Mexico gasoline logistics system, even for diesel, jet, and gasoline. And some of them are going to be done in early 2019. Understand these were major projects, major pipeline, investments. And what we understand is at the terminals that are being built down here in Mexico, every one of them have a forward-looking prerogative and have included the materials of construction to ensure those tanks could indeed, in fact, store ethanol in the future. So we think early 2019 probably is some of the, some of the earliest new tank commissioning that will happen.
Well, through the wonders of the internet, Ryan LeGrand also sent an answer to that while you were talking too, just to make sure that I think if I understand right, Kristy, and I saw this in one of your other presentations, don't they import something like 70% of their fuel needs right now anyway in Mexico, regardless of what fuel it is?
Yes, they do. The oil refineries down here are severely taxed with, some of the new fuel quality requirements, and they've had some safety incidents, and so the refineries are only operating at about 40% capacity. And so we're seeing the largest supplier to Mexico, and it's between the 60 and 70% range, is the United States.
Okay, so the answer I got from Ryan was currently the Energy Regulatory Commission has granted 26 storage and distribution permits for liquid fuel terminals, and they are evaluating 8 additional projects. In addition, 10 liquid fuel terminal projects have been announced in the media but have not entered the process of evaluation by the Energy Regulatory Commission. Timeline from those completion of those terminals ranges from 10 months to 2 or more years. So there's your answer. And I think with that, we've got a couple more questions here that I will answer separately through an email or a phone call. But Kristy's, I know, on a tight schedule too, and I think we had an hour blocked out for this. So if you have any more questions, feel free to email them to me. I want to thank Kristy for her efforts to get to this thing in the first place and to work it into her schedule. Really appreciate that, Kristy. Thank you. And
it's my pleasure.
You bet. And thank all of you for taking part in it. And stay in touch. We'll let you know the next time we have a webinar, but we appreciate your taking part in it and hope you got some information you can use. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your day and good week. Thank you.